This is a 1996 BMW M3, the E36 M3. For a long time, the E36 has been the other M3. Not as cool and vintage as the original E30, but not as fast as the later models. However, it's starting to get more interest and appreciation from enthusiasts and collectors, and it's starting to become more valuable. And today, I'm going to review the E36 M3 and explain why. Of course, I'll also show you all of the quirks and features of the E36 M3, so let's get started. Before I get started, big news, this E36 M3 is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This is a Euro E36 M3 with more power than US models, and it has relatively low mileage and a very cool interior. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this E36 M3, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features, the E36 M3 with the powertrain, which is important to mention because this one is a Euro model. That's a big deal in the E36 M3 world because the US spec model had significantly less power than European versions of this car. In the States, we only got 240 horsepower in our E36 M3, but in Europe, originally they had a 3-liter 6-cylinder with 285 horsepower, and later, that was boosted to a 3.2-liter 6-cylinder with 320 horsepower, which this car has. So this has about an 80 horsepower increase over the US model E36 M3. And as a result, this is the E36 M3 to get, the one everybody wants. A European model, which had more power than the American car generally, but this is a later version with even more power than that, 320 in an E36 M3, which was pretty good. Now, that is a pretty healthy figure, but it's worth noting that even the US spec E36 M3s were sort of muscly, especially compared to the earlier model. The original E30 M3 only had a 4-cylinder with about 215 horsepower, so even the 240 in a 6-cylinder from the US spec M3 was an improvement over that, and it did add more performance, but this is the one you really want. And the changes to the Euro E36 M3s went beyond just extra engine power. There was a lot more to it than that. These cars had an upgraded differential, they had better headlights, there was a lot of other stuff. One other major change was the transmission. These later model Euro cars with the larger engine got a 6-speed manual transmission, while a 5-speed manual was the max you could get in the United States. And speaking of transmission, US E36 M3 models also had an optional torque converter automatic, which was never available in Europe. It was only available in the States because BMW at the time figured Americans would like a simple, basic, slow torque converter automatic in their M3s, which was kind of a shame. So then you might be wondering why? Why did the Euro version get so many benefits that the US one didn't? What was the deal? The answer is quite simply cost. BMW and their dealerships in the 90s didn't think American buyers would spend more money to get a better engine and other upgrades for the Euro cars, and so they had to cut various things out of the US spec M3 in order to meet a price point that BMW thought its customers would actually be willing to pay for these cars. Now, of course, what actually happened was the E36 M3 was wildly successful in the United States, even with its mere 240 horsepower, and it kind of showed BMW that, hey, there is a market in the US for M cars. As a result, after this, the US market pretty much got all the same M3s as the European market, with a few little exceptions here and there, but they never had such a massive delta in power following the E36 M3. But anyway, back up front in this car, and specifically under the hood, I want to move on to the quirks and features. And one quirk I rather like is that BMW M engines from this era say BMW M power in huge letters on the side, so you know exactly what you're looking at. Not just a regular BMW engine, but indeed an M engine. Also up here, a few items worth noting in terms of changes compared to a standard 3 Series. Probably the most obvious in the front is this front lip spoiler that gives the car a more aggressive look, but you also had a larger air intake, fog lights up here, just a more aggressive, bolder front end in the M3 to give it a sportier, more performance-y look compared to a regular 3 Series. And on the side of the car, there were more cosmetic changes to distinguish the M3 from a standard 3 Series. One is this black molding trim going down the side. As you can see, it says M3 in the front part of the doors to underscore the fact that this is indeed an M3. Now below that, you also had these rocker panels, which were sort of famous from the M3. They twist in the middle, as you can see, and form kind of a distinctive shape, which only the M3 had. And that's an easy way to tell apart these cars from a standard 3 Series, which had no twist. Now, one other difference on the side of the E36 M3 compared to a standard E36 is the mirrors. The M3s had these tiny, intended to be aerodynamic mirrors, and maybe they were, but they were also really small. They significantly hampered visibility, but that's something you put up with in order to improve your aero. One other change on the side is these wheels. I love these M3 wheels. Several different wheel options available for the E36 M3, but these are my very favorites. They look cool and performance-y and special, and they have little M's in the center cap area to distinguish them again from any standard 3 Series wheel. And next up, around back, there were still more changes to the E36 M3 to distinguish it from regular 3 Series models. The biggest was the rear bumper, where you had this sort of diffuser looking thing at the bottom, this black panel that came out, which was a dead giveaway that you were looking at an M3. You also had a little dual exhaust over on one side of the rear bumper, which gave it sort of a performance-y look as well, and that helped you out in back. Now, interestingly, there wasn't much exterior badging on this car to tell everybody what you had. You obviously have an M3 logo back here on the trunk, as you can see, and you had those little M3s in the door molding on the side like I showed you, but that was pretty much it. Compare that to modern M cars that have giant M logos on the brakes and huge wheels and gills on the side. It's totally different. This car was a lot more subtle. Most people back then didn't even know what an M3 was until it was beating them. And then you could see just this badge as kind of the only indication that it was an M car. But anyway, next you climb inside the E36 M3 and you quickly discover one of my very favorite things about this entire car, and that would be this interior. Specifically, this cloth pattern on the seats, as you can see, looks both ridiculous and very 1990s. The cloth is especially cool because leather has this sort of luxury car feel to it, and most US M3s had leather, but more of the Euro cars had cloth and also Alcantara on the outside of the seats, as you can see, which gave it sort of a more sporty and also more lightweight kind of performance car feel. But this pattern was really the coolest thing about this interior, and BMW called it the M Cross interior pattern. You can see it on the seats and also on the door panels, where you have more M Cross interior in here. Now, BMW called this M Cross because there were like crossing patterns in the M colors, as you can see if you look closely, so you kind of understand where M Cross comes from. And there were several different interiors that BMW offered like this. Another was called M Rain, which sort of had like raindrop looking things plus the M logo, and there was also M Hurricane, which followed sort of a similar theme, but M Cross is probably the most unusual and strange, and certainly so perfectly 90s. Now, another interesting thing this car has is manual seats instead of power seats. You can see all the levers on the side of the seat to control various different adjustments for the manual seats. This is unusual by modern standards, but back in the 90s, this car hadn't yet established itself as both a luxury car and a performance car like M3 models that came later. So manual seats seats were kinda normal on a performance-focused car like the M3. Now, interestingly, one of the levers on the side of the seat controls forward and backward movement. You pull this one and then you can move forward or backwards, as you can see. Obviously, in most modern cars with manual seats, that's controlled with a bar under the seats, but not so in the M3. It was part of this array of levers on the side. Now, the next thing you notice when you climb in here after taking a long look at the interior pattern is the dashboard, and specifically the controls are heavily tilted towards the driver. This used to be a hallmark of BMW vehicles, and to an extent they still do it on some of their models, but back then you can see it was a huge focus of the interior, driver focused, and all the controls were angled pretty significantly in that way because BMWs were being pitched then as the ultimate driving machine, and drivers were the main focus, and so the controls were focused on the driver. Now, a couple of interesting things about this center control stack. One is obviously the very strange climate vent at the top above the radio, which takes on a bizarre shape because of this strange angle of the dashboard towards the driver. It looks weird, but it works because it gives the driver 2 climate vents on their side, and then the passenger gets another 2 climate vents on their side, so everything is equitable in here. Now, speaking of the radio, this is the BMW Business radio. As you can see, there were 2 versions. There was Business or Professional. Business, I guess, was intended to be more basic and more simple and down to business. Professional was for like music fans, and it had more cool functions and features. I guess maybe for music professionals, I'm not really sure, but that's what they called them. But anyway, at the bottom of the center control stack, you can see a screen and some buttons down here, and this is a very early example of kind of an infotainment screen that we see in modern cars. This will show you temp. If you press temp, will give you the temperature, and you can change it between Celsius and Fahrenheit. It will also check all of the vehicle systems if you press check to make sure there's nothing currently wrong, and you can press clock or date, and of course it will show you the clock or date on this smaller screen next to you. Now, strangely enough, there are 4 buttons off to the left side that say 1000, 110, and 1. Those buttons are used to change various numbers in here. So for instance, if you're setting the clock, you would press the 1000 button to change the first digit, and then the 100 button to change the second digit, and then the 10 to change the third, and the 1 to change the last. It's a very strange way of doing that, but that's how BMW did it at the time, in this sort of rudimentary information display in the center. And speaking of kind of strange displays, when you go to turn on this car, there are several green dots that line up in this weird pattern in the gauge cluster. That is your oil change interval sensor. The green dots would slowly disappear as you drove the car more and more miles until they turned orange and then red, letting you know that it was time for an oil change. Looks a little cryptic and strange by modern standards, but back then that was an early attempt at an oil change interval reminder. And what you're seeing here are some of the very earliest attempts at like a gauge cluster screen and a center information screen, which of course have grown up to the screens we know today that have so many vehicle functions. But anyway, aside from that stuff, this interior is actually fairly basic, which was common of BMW interiors at the time. They were focused, they were simple, they were easy to figure out, and they just kind of had what you need. There's not even all that many M logos in here. You have one at the base of the steering wheel, as you can see, and you have another one on the door sill when you open up the door, although that's not visible when the door is closed, so you don't even see that when you're sitting in the car. You also have another M logo at the top of the gear lever, and that was it. There was really no other M stuff in here unless you count the M cross upholstery that was finished in the M colors. You didn't have M in the headrests or the floor mats or anywhere else in here. It was all pretty basic and simple. But by the way, speaking of that gear lever for a second, you can see this is the 6-speed manual that was only offered on the later Euro M3s like this one. This is the most desirable transmission that these cars came with, but interestingly, it wasn't the only transmission offered in Europe. I mentioned American cars offered a torque converter automatic that was never available in Europe, but an early version of BMW's SMG automatic was offered on later Euro E36 M3s. It was not a common option, but you could get SMG with an E36 M3 in Europe. And of course, that must feel like a horribly rudimentary, early, bad example of SMG, but they put it in these cars as a predecessor to what, of course, would become the regular automatic transmission in the next generation M3, the E46, where SMG is pretty common. By the way, one other thing you notice inside this car, the mirrors are really annoying. I mentioned them on the outside that they were different for the M cars, but sitting in here, they are so tiny. You really can't see anything out of them, and that's something you clearly see when you're driving around in this car, just how compromised that mirror design really was. But anyway, next we move on to the back seat in the E36 M3, which is quite small, as you might imagine. To get back here, you pull this little lever on the side of the front seat, you push it forward, and it sort of moves out of the way. But you just kind of gotta squeeze in here, and you just don't have all that much rear seat space. Although you could have had more if you wanted, and that's because the E36 was the first M3 that was offered as a sedan. You could get a four-door sedan in this car. Now, part of the reason they did that is because they canceled the E34 M5 in about 95, and they didn't come back with another M5 until 99. So to bridge that span of years without an M5 in the lineup, they decided to offer an M3 as a sedan for the first time. Now, in the next generation M3, there was an M5 in the lineup the whole time, so no M3 sedan was offered, although it has been available ever since then, starting in about 2008 or 2009. Now, aside from the sedan body style, which, like I said, was new for the E36 M3, there were two other bodies available. There was the coupe, which obviously this car is, and there was a convertible E36 M3, but that didn't deviate from the norm because the original E30 M3 was also offered as a coupe or convertible, just like this one. But anyway, rear seats in this car, again, nothing too unusual except that they're pretty cramped for adults, and the seat belts come out of the center, which was always a strange thing about this car. They don't come out from the sides like in most other cars. They're mounted in the center, and then you put them over your right shoulder, and then you buckle yourself like next to the side of the car. It was sort of an unusual way to do it, but it was an E36 M3 hallmark. Now, also back here, you can of course see the M Cross interior design, which looks just as strange in back as it did up front. And back here, you also have ventilating windows. You can open up the rear windows to vent just like this. That was all you could do. You couldn't roll them down, but it did give you a little extra airflow back here. And this was a common thing that a lot of 80s and 90s cars had in the back, a window that could just vent open a couple of inches for some added fresh air for rear passengers. But anyway, next we move on to the back of the E36 M3. And before I get into the trunk, I want to talk brake lights for a second because they were kind of strange. You had this rather large taillight assembly in this car, at least large for the size of the vehicle, but the only part that lit up was this one. You can see the tiny inner part of the brake light. That's not because these brake lights are broken. That was how they were designed. Only a small part, maybe a quarter of the brake light, is actually the brake light. The rest is just reflector, which seems like kind of the wrong ratio to me. But anyway, getting into the cargo area, you push this little button and the trunk pops right open, and you can see a couple of interesting quirks in here. One, on the inside of the trunk lid, you have this panel. You unscrew the top part and then it pops down and reveals that it's a toolkit. And when it's open, it stays perfectly level, so it can sort of be used as a toolkit table, which could be important if you're trying to use the tools on the side of the road to change a tire or fix some other broken item. Now, also in this trunk over on the side, you can see this road flare, which is built into a little compartment made for it and resting on top of the CD changer back here, which is of course factory. So you had your CD changer and then a road flare compartment directly above it. But aside from that stuff, the trunk itself is actually pretty big. For a little car, you can see, look in there, and it's a deep and relatively large trunk where you can stick a lot of stuff. And you have these little cargo straps going across the middle section, so if you wanted to tie something down and keep it from rolling around, you could do that in your E36 M3 trunk. And so those are the quirks and features of the E36 BMW M3. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Euro E36 M3. I have wanted to do a video on an E36 M3 for a long time, but I'm glad I waited because this one is really the best version of the car, with the 6-speed manual, with the bigger powertrain, and with obviously more power. This is the one, if you will. And it's also unmodified, which is a challenge to find. A lot of people have reached out to me over the years with E36 M3s in cool colors. I wanted to review them, but they were lowered and had wheels and a body kit and blah, 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 and it just wasn't gonna happen. So first things first about this car, let me bring it out. Let's just see if it's fast. Whew. Yeah, it's reasonably quick. I'm not ready to necessarily call it fast. Here I'm 5,000 RPM, I'm gonna go up. Yeah, wow, it's pretty quick, actually. Considering what this car is, especially, it's pretty quick. And it's certainly quicker than the US version. And I think that that's an important point to mention. Some people say that the US version has some advantages. I don't really see them. This car obviously had more power and some other improvements in addition to that really made it a compelling vehicle compared to the US model, and the extra power really was a part of that. The thing that people really love about this car, though, was the steering and handling. It's just steered and handled fantastically, and I gotta say, this car is amazing. You know, I owned a 98 E36 M3 sedan, and I never really got why people said the steering and handling was so good. I think because mine had a lot of miles and was kind of rough, and the suspension wasn't so great. Well, this one's only got about 60,000 miles, a little more, and it's a totally different animal. It feels tight, it feels enjoyable. It's a lot more engaging than my car felt. And I don't think that that is a US Euro difference necessarily. I think it's more of this is what a nice one can feel like. And honestly, that's difficult to come by these days because so many of these just aren't nice. I will say also this powertrain feels more eager, even at like 3,000 RPM. When you floor it, still doesn't feel like amazingly fast, but when you just put your foot down, like to do a quick pass or accelerate just a little bit, it just has more power. It feels like it fills in the power a little bit more at the low end, and it has just a lot more power at the high end. And I think that this car is a significant improvement over the US model in terms of performance and acceleration. It just feels quicker. And I still don't want to say that this car is like really fast or amazing at only 320 horsepower. It's not incredible. But it definitely feels quicker. You know, I recently did a video ranking the M3s from best to worst, and I ranked this one, the E36 M3, the worst, although I was specifically referring to the US model, which certainly was the worst M3. But there's an appreciation that I'm starting to have for these cars for a few reasons. One is they're just so little and tossable and fun. And that used to be true of the E30 M3, and obviously it still is. The cars have gotten bigger, but it has gotten more expensive and harder to find. And this car, for a lot less money, still has that light tossable feel that later M3s certainly lost. And when you combine that with extra power on the low end and a lot of extra power on the high end, this car suddenly has a lot more appeal to it, the E36 M3. And if I was getting one, I would certainly get one like this, including with this ridiculous cloth interior. You know, I really like cars at about this power range. 300 to 350 horsepower to me has always been, especially in a car this size. Like, to me, this feels like the reason I love the M2 competition so much now is the same reason that I like this car a lot, which is it's the right power for the size, and the size is small and tossable. And this car feels like one you can kind of throw it around and have fun with it. The steering and handling is excellent. The acceleration is better than I expected. This car totally livens up the E36 M3, and it totally becomes a different and improved experience. And I really do think this is a significantly better car than the US market one, and with good reason. I mean, I understand BMW at the time didn't think it would sell as well, so they were trying to hit a price point, but this car not trying to hit that same price point, you can tell, of course, it's going to be a better car, and to me, it feels like it is, and it's an enjoyable car to drive. It really is. And so that's the E36 M3, the Euro E36 M3, which makes this car even more notable and cool. I prefer most other M3 models compared to this one, but this car is starting to grow on me, especially the Euro version with its excellent driving experience, and it's just starting to feel more vintagey and cool. And it's getting hard to find a nice one, but you can find this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the E36 M3 a DOUGSCORE. And the DOUGSCORE is here, 54 out of 100, which places the E36 M3 in some fantastic company, tied with the car that succeeded it, the E46 M3, and just behind some iconic sports cars of this era, like the Ferrari F355 and the NSX. The E36 M3 was neutered in the US, but foreign market models were much improved, and this particular one is the ultimate example, being a really nice foreign market coupe with a manual transmission. These E36 M3 models are quickly shooting up in value, and the Euro version is the one to get, and I strongly suspect in 10 years we'll be talking about how we wish we bought these for what they're selling for now.